broadcasting, the online broadcasting of the Dissertation Board meeting. May I declare the meeting of the Dissertation Board open to consider the dissertation by Elmira Vasileva, Charlotte Bronte's and Elizabeth Gaskell's literary works in the context of the early Victorian spiritual search, specialty 100103, foreign literature, literature of Europe, America, and Australia. May I remind you to switch off your mobile devices. Thank you for compliance. Today we are having audio-visual broadcasting online at St. Petersburg University website, as well as simultaneous interpretation from Russian into English and from English into Russian. According to the decree number 9301/01 as of September 25, 2017, me, Larisa Poloboyarinova, was entitled to chair this dissertation board meeting. May I introduce my colleagues, members of the jury. Veronika Altashina, Doctor of Philology, docent, professor at Foreign Literature History Department, St. Petersburg University. Julieta Alilova, Doctor of Philology, docent, English Language for Oriental Studies Department, St. Petersburg State University. Tatiana Fedyaeva, Doctor of Philology, docent, professor at Foreign Languages Department, St. Petersburg State Agricultural University. Natalia Sokolova, Doctor of Philology, professor at World Literature Department, Moscow Pedagogical University. Christine Baron, professor in comparative literature. Thèse de doctorat 1996, habilitation à diriger des recherches 2007, professor at Unité de formation et de recherche lettres et langues, University of Poitiers, France. Professor Baron is together with us in an online mode. I should also inform you that according to Provision 17, Section 3, the procedure of the Dissertation Board meeting at the relevant document to entitle the degree of a candidate of sciences or the doctor of sciences. According to this document, the Dissertation Board meeting is considered legitimate if all the members of the board are present, but no less than 2/3 of the priorly appointed composition of the Dissertation Board. Today we are having the quorum. We have 5 members of the jury, one of them being online. This means that the quorum is there and we can start. According to Provision 19, Section 4, the procedure of the Dissertation Board meeting of the aforementioned decree, the procedure of the Dissertation Board meeting is as follows. First, a brief report of the chair on the documents provided by the defendant, replies to questions. Second, brief report by the defendant looking into key provisions of the research. Third, questions to the defendant and the defendant's replies. 4, reports submitted to the Dissertation Board by members of the jury. Members of the jury take turns in reading out their reports and asking questions to the defendant. 5, general commentaries of the defendant and answers to the questions of members of the jury. 6, open discussion. Members of the audience, those who are not part of the jury, can also participate and address questions to the defendant. No more than 5 minutes per every speaker. Everyone wishing to take the floor has to register in advance in a specific registration list and introduce themselves, their name and position before taking the floor. 7. General commentaries of the defendant and replies to questions from members of the audience. 8. The address of the defendant's supervisor. 9. 5 minutes break and voting on whether the defendant has passed or failed. The procedure of the voting is not being broadcast online. 10. Open voting by name, count of vote by the chair of the jury, and registration of the results in the protocol. Decision-making, whether pass or fail. 11. The concluding remarks of the defendant. Now, may I proceed to the chair's brief report. The dissertation submitted by Elmira Vasileva in the specialty 10.0103, Foreign Literature, Literature of Europe, America, and Australia, under the title Charlotte Bronte's and Elizabeth Gaskell's Literary Works in the Context of the Early Victorian Spiritual Search, was accepted for defense under relevant decree of St. Petersburg State University number 9289/1 as of November 23, 2016. However, once the composition of the dissertation board and the jury was approved under relevant decree, a mistake was made. Therefore, the defense that took place on February 17, 2017, and its results were declared void and illegitimate, and therefore we are doing a repeat defense today. The dissertation by Elmira Vasileva was accepted for a repeat defense under relevant degree by Alexander Gnotov as of September 27, 2017, number 9438/1. For the repeat defense, the new composition of the jury was declared under decree as of September 25, 2017, number 9301/1, in the composition as declared before. The defendant has submitted all the documents in accordance with the requirements of Provision 12, Section 3, presentation of a dissertation for defense, according to the dissertation defense procedure. Shall I read out all the documents provided by the defendant? So we need a technical break, distinguished colleagues, because there is no video, audio-visual connection with the member of the dissertation board who is in line with Professor Baron. Thank you. Distinguished colleagues, distinguished guests, we'll be having some technical interferences, so now we have no audiovisual connection with Professor Baron, but although we won't be able to have the connection with Professor Baron back, we'll still move on because the quorum is there. So once again, may I ask you whether I should read out the list of all the documents submitted by Madam Vasileva, because nothing has changed as of the first defense. So now may I proceed to the procedures follows according to the dissertation defense procedure. Now I give the floor to Elmira Vasileva for her brief report on her dissertation. Do you hear me? Great. Distinguished colleagues, distinguished members of the dissertation board, distinguished chair of the jury, in the very first place, I would like to thank all of you for being here today. The early Victorian age in the history of Great Britain, of which I mostly write in my thesis, was a period of contrast, contradictions, and multiple paradoxes, one of the most illustrative among them being the confrontation between science and religion. It makes us wonder today how it is even possible that the period of the most impetuous scientific advance, the time when scientific empirical knowledge was finally established as the dominating means of perceiving and exploring the world, happened also to be the time of the most prominent spiritual recovery. This phenomenon projected itself on all the spheres of life, including the culture and consequently the literature of the period. My initial theory was that Christianity, as an ethical and cultural system, a particular type of discourse of those times, influenced the fiction of the period in many ways and did not strictly limit itself to simple allusions to the Holy Bible or certain plot elements, but rather manifested itself on the structural level. Victorian authors perceived an artfully arranged, ready-made formula and compositional structures. In chapters 2 and 3 of my research, I studied this phenomenon in the literary works of two famous lady authors of the period, Charlotte Bronte and Elizabeth Gaskell. The lives of the two ladies have strikingly a lot in common. Both of them are daughters of clergymen, both married to clergymen in turn, and they thought a lot about faith, and through their literary work took an active part in most burning polemics of the day. In the second chapter, I deal with Charlotte Bronte's works. She was brought up by a strict evangelical father to utterly dismiss Catholicism and to strongly doubt Puritanism with its central doctrine of predestination. Her views are openly expressed in her Jane Eyre novel, written as a parody on two Catholic genres, a confessional text and a hagiographical text. Jane confesses before her reader. However, Bronte deliberately shows her to be an unreliable narrator who tries to tell her story in such a way as to win the reader's sympathy. So Bronte uses ready-made formulas that she adopts from hagiography. Yet the internal hidden level of the novel allows me to declare that the author herself subtly criticizes her character for her lies and for her pride. This anti-Catholic line in Bronte's work is developed in her later novel, Villette, with its central character, Lucy Snow, being represented as an ambassador of the religion of common sense in a Catholic country in Europe. Anti-Catholic discourse in this novel seems to me a highly symptomatic phenomenon for the early 1950s, when the no popery movement was very widely spread in England. Charlotte Bronte, being part of this circle, actively participated in these polemics. She shows how her heroine stays true to her religion and her culture. The third chapter in my research is dedicated to Elizabeth Gaskell's literary heritage. Gaskell, a Christian writer, is just as interesting as an object for critical thought, for she always positioned her art as a form of religious discipline. In this context, her Christian short stories, which she published in cheap literary magazines in Britain and in America, are of particular interest. I deal with them in the first part of the 3rd chapter. I believe that these novels, these short stories, allowed Gaskell to work with various compositional and stylistic devices. Elizabeth Gaskell is traditionally viewed as a conservative, totally Victorian author. However, I strongly insist she was also a real revolutionary when it comes to the issue of composition. For example, in her Ruth, she boldly experiments with the structure of a Protestant sermon. Like the preacher of the early 19th century, she uses the abstract notion she attempts to study as the title for her piece of writing. At the same time, she does not seem to betray the popular 18th century literature tradition of naming the book after her main character. Having thus reconciled religious and secular traditions, she successfully creates a highly individual text, the complexity of which, I'm sorry to say, with all due respect, her contemporaries entirely failed to appreciate. In the Cranford part of my research, I try to show that despite the general opinion of this novel as a completely entertaining piece of Elizabeth Gaskell's writing, as an almost unique example of an easy read in her legacy, it is in fact just as a serious State of England novel as Ruth. Here, Elizabeth Gaskell works with another traditional Christian genre, eschatological text, and draws a parallel between St. John's concept of the 1,000-year-long reign of Christ and the ideal reality she pictures in her novel. In the Apocalypse, the promises of resurrection to eternal life belong to the domain of the future. And this revival was going on through a grave crisis of values and a tragic loss of cultural identity that took place in Great Britain. Thus, my initial theory of the structural influence of the Christian discourse on the early Victorian Christian fiction has been proven to be true, at least for the aforesaid material. I have also managed to ascertain the fact that the two lady novelists, Charlotte Bronte and Elizabeth Gaskell, not only saw their tasks as Christian authors very differently indeed, but also chose different paths in their work with Christian literature. Thus, Charlotte Bronte's pathos is in general dictated by her utter rejection of Catholic teaching. And in her works, what we find out is a lot of evangelical patriotism. Elizabeth Gaskell, on the contrary, has shown itself to be a profound religious thinker, but also an experimentalist in terms of composition of her works. In her novels, Ruth and Cranford, she skillfully knits together the traditional structures of such religious genres as a sermon or an eschatological text with the conventions of Victorian fiction. The revelation of a very important historical and cultural context has allowed me to look in a fresh way at the works of two quite famous authors, and this hopefully will lead to our ideas of the literary heritage of this wonderful epoch being extended and enriched. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Elmira. This was the defendant's report. On the key provisions of the dissertation, Elmira, please do not leave the podium, because there might be questions from the members of the audience. Do members of the audience have any questions only referring to Elmira's report? We see no questions. Thank you, Elmira. Okay, let's now proceed to the next point in the procedure. This is declaring the reports of the members of the jury. We have reports submitted by all the 7 members of the jury, and the new report was submitted by Professor Brontë, who kindly agreed to be member of the jury. All the reports were submitted duly according to the candidate degree awarding procedure in St. Petersburg University. No external reports were provided. Before we give the floor to Professor Brontë, I would like to ask my colleagues who took part in the first hearing in the first dissertation board meeting whether over the 9 months that have passed since then, their evaluation of the dissertation has changed or not, or whether their decision has changed or not. Please provide your response by declaring your name. Veronika Altashina, my opinion is the same. I believe that Elmira Vasileva deserves to be awarded the inspired degree of Candidate of Sciences. Professor Avilova, my opinion has not changed. I believe that Elmira Vasileva deserves to be awarded the inspired degree. Professor Sokolova, I believe that Elmira Vasileva deserves to be awarded the inspired degree of Candidate of Sciences in Literature. Professor Fedyaeva, my opinion is unchanged, and my assessment of Elmira's dissertation is the same. Thank you so much. Well, my opinion has not changed as well. Therefore, I suggest that we do not declare the report submitted by members of the first jury and directly proceed to giving the floor to the new member of the jury, Professor Brontë. Do you agree, distinguished members of the jury? Yes, we do. Thank you so much. I would like to give the floor to Professor Christine Baron.
Thank you very much. I think I had lost the connection for a few minutes, but now everything works. So I'll start to read my report about the thesis by Elmira Viktorovna Vasileva, Brontë, and Elizabeth Gaskell in the context of the early Victorian spiritual search. The thesis submitted Elmira Vasileva focuses on the early Victorian period through the examination of the works published by 2 well-known writers, Elizabeth Gaskell and Charlotte Brontë. The religious aspects of these writers are enlightened by many references to the historical and spiritual context in which their works were elaborated. In the introduction, the spiritual background of this period is thoroughly examined. Mrs. Vasileva has selected the most relevant bibliographical references in English of critical works and also in the Russian tradition of thought about the English 19th century. She explains clearly the methodological basis of her research by intersecting of biographical, historical, and comparative approaches of the authors. The first chapter of the thesis is dedicated to the historical foundation of what Mrs. Vasileva, the evangelical revival in England. As the influence of the thought concerns especially young unmarried women, some women preachers emerged at that period. The thesis deals also the influence of many schools of religious thought. For example, Calvinism, the doctrine of predestination, had an increasing influence in the society. Congregationalists and Presbyterians tried to accommodate those doctrines to the modern world. The influence of these trends is so strong in the Victorian society that it is possible to assert that most For example, most of Dickens' text can be interpreted as parables. At the same time, the rising of natural science and the scandal of Darwin's perspective challenged the principles of religion. The second chapter deals with Charlotte Bronte's novels Villette and Jeanne. Mrs. Vasileva insists on the fact that when Jeanne was published, it was first described as a preeminently anti-Christian composition. The critics were in their majority hostile to the heroine's vision of the world. Mrs. Vasileva convincingly explains that they did take into account the fact that the storyteller was a liar. This narrative strategy is enlightened by A. Rigby, who showed that the same story is told on two different levels. Of course, this complexity has been a source of misunderstanding. Another controversial work is Villette, which has been described as an anti-Catholic novel. The chapter 3 is dedicated to Elizabeth Gaskell's work, depicted as an evolution from ethics to poetics. Mrs. Vasileva starts with three edifying stories. Elizabeth Gaskell is generally considered as an heiress of Jane Austen. The typology of her works, Christian short stories, sensations short stories, and everyday short stories, is relevant. The author believes in the educational power of fiction, which makes her novels sometimes too didactic. The analysis of Zulta's summer novel is quite convincing. Less convincing is the artistic program of this writer, which seems inexistent. The thesis quotes an impressive number of critics and writers, and Mrs. Vasileva unmistakably read Elizabeth Gaskell and Charlotte Bronte's works. Mrs. Vasileva shows also a real knowledge of the period and a deep knowledge of the religious atmosphere and controversies in the 19th century. The bibliography is well organized, and the principal relevant works about the period and the writers are systematically quoted. Nevertheless, I have serious doubt about the comparative method of the thesis. In fact, the analysis of the writer's novels are not really compared, but juxtaposed. Even if some similarities are pointed out, they don't lead to a real comparison between the writers, their beliefs or lack of faith, their poetics or their conceptions of literature. On the other hand, the descriptions of the novel are serious, well-informed, but doesn't lead to a self-reflexive description of the aims of this topic of research. The biography of the authors is not really a relevant criterion for a real comparison of their novels. Mrs. Vasileva refers to many critical traditions, but she doesn't choose between these different critical points of view. This leads to an impression of critical syncretism, which doesn't make a distinction between several approaches of literature. You cannot equate, for example, dialogism and Joss's perspectives. Some remarks belongs to a tradition of critical thought, but are not identified as such. And the critics refer to an introduction disappear in the analysis of the text. For example, it would have been useful to remind the theories of reception in the chapter 2 about the reception of Bronte's Jeanne. In spite of these comments, which will be, I hope, useful to Mrs. Vasileva if she wants to publish the issues of her reflection, this thesis demonstrates a very close link between the author's positions and the religious context. The analysis of the reactions provoked by the novels of the authors are very relevant. The thesis also shows a close reading of the authors and a relevant choice of references. Mrs. Vasileva has intensively worked on a difficult subject. She translated her thesis in a perfect English, and that is the reason why I recommend accepting this thesis. The thesis submitted by Elmira Viktorovna Vasileva, Charlotte Bronte's and Elizabeth Gaskell's literary works in the context of the early Victorian spiritual search corresponds to the requirements by the decree from 01/2016 and 68/211 on the procedure of the award of the scientific degree at State University of St. Petersburg. The candidate therefore deserves to be granted, on my opinion, with the scientific degree of Doctor of Philology in specialty 10/01/03. Thank you for your attention.
Now we give the floor to the defendant, to Elmira Vasileva, to provide her replies.
Okay. Now, yes, but presently, no. There was a problem of connection again.
Remarks and valuable recommendations, which I will most definitely use in my future work in this direction. However, at the moment, I would like to shortly comment on a number of statements in your review, in your report, which drew my particular attention, if it's all right with you. So let me begin with quoting from your report. Quote, Ms. Vasileva insists on the fact that when Jane Eyre was published, it was first described as a preeminently anti-Christian composition, end of quote. On pages 255 and 293, I suggest that Jane Eyre was enthusiastically received by the 19th century British readers, who, however, I'm afraid, did not care to analyze the religious aspect of the novel, but rather argued on the personality of the author and eagerly followed the romantic plot. The only critic who dared to express doubts in the Christian wholesomeness of this novel was an Elizabeth Rigby, who published a very negative review of Jane Eyre, in which she did call the novel an anti-Christian composition. I do support her attitude in many ways, and I quote her article abundantly in my thesis because I use it as a basis for my own analysis. Yet I must stress that Rigby's point of view does not reflect the general attitude to Bronte's composition, but rather presents an interesting exception. I would also allow myself to argue with your statement that Elizabeth Gaskell's artistic program seems inexistent. My point is that Mrs. Gaskell was one of the most original and innovative writers of her time. I would go as far as to say that if we compare Charlotte Bronte and Elizabeth Gaskell, which I generally do not do out of respect to both ladies, we will inevitably come to a most interesting conclusion. You see, whereas Bronte's literary gift was very, very natural, very much informed by her own passionate character, her particular fineness of feeling, I might say, Elizabeth Gaskell's talent was a cultivated one, developed through inner discipline and constant practice. I would not regard her as not having a properly articulated artistic program only because there is no document where it would be consecutively expounded. Yet we have Gaskell's diaries and her letters in which she more than once very clearly states how she feels about her works and why she creates them in the first place. We know precisely that her prime goal was to depict life as she knew it, with all the bad things, with all the dark sides of life she was well aware of too. And I think that is a perfect artistic program for a Victorian lady novelist. And in many ways, this program is superior to those of many male authors of the time. There is another principal point in Professor Baron's report concerning the comparative approach of my thesis. I do acknowledge that in our field the term comparative covers several notions, and of course here I do not use it in the sense of comparative literary studies. In my research I've been concentrating on one national literature only, and yet I would suggest that no juxtaposition is possible without primary comparison. And I do hope the implied comparison of the two writers is what my readers come to after they get acquainted with my analysis of Bronte's and Gaskell's texts. And in this respect, of course, I guess the biographical details prepare their readers for that sort of thinking. Finally, I should say a few words trying to alleviate Professor Baron's doubts concerning my critical syncretism. I'm really sorry if my methodological position leaves an impression of me being unable to choose between several traditions, but I should emphasize that I quite deliberately try to embrace several approaches, several critical paradigms, in order to achieve a sort of a fish-eye effect on the texts themselves. In this, I follow mostly the traditions of St. Petersburg School of Literary Studies, which seriously doubts that faithfulness to just one methodological paradigm is obligatory in a work of academic writing. In most cases, it just leads to a one-sided impression of the work of art and a very mechanistic analysis, whereas several approaches, I believe, combined, can present a fuller picture. I'm sorry if this position is not articulated clearly in the text of my thesis, nor is made perfectly obvious through the analysis, but I'm still in the very beginning of my career, and in the future I will surely pay more attention to the methodological issues. And in the meantime, I would like to thank you for the clever hint at how the text of my thesis could be improved. So, to conclude, I would like to once again thank Professor Baron cordially for her kind response to my work, for her thought-provoking remarks, which I value very highly, because for me it is an enormous privilege to have a dialogue, to exchange opinions with such a renowned scholar. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I am.
Thank you.
Являются возможные выступления.
The contributions, the statements of members of the audience who are not members of the jury. Do members of the audience would like to take the floor to ask the defendant some question or to provide some statement or contribution? I see no people wishing to take the floor. In that case, Elmira, thank you so much. May I now give the floor to the research supervisor, Professor Burova, Irina Burova, Professor of Foreign Literature Department, St. Petersburg University. Well, Elmira is my favorite postgraduate student, and I once again would like to repeat the words that I said here in this very room on February 17, 2017. I'm proud to have such an outstanding, such a marvelous postgraduate student. I was happy to see how she grew up professionally since her second year in St. Petersburg University as a student, and I was always happy for her successes. I was always proud with her successes. She was a star. She always used to be the star of our department, of our faculty, and it was clear that she was bound to be our promise. I had no doubt that the defense as of February 17 would pass. And I value highly the opinion of my colleagues who gave such a high assessment, such a worthy assessment of her dissertation. But the events to follow manifested one more dimension of Elmira's character. She is very stubborn, a very stubborn researcher, and she is very brave. She's a highly brave person. I indeed marveled at how brave she was and how determined she was, and in her perception, in her understanding of the ultimate decision of the university when the results of her defense were cancelled. I would like now to express my deepest respect to my colleagues who supported us in this very difficult grief moment. Those were our colleagues, I mean experts in philology and literature, but also the administration of St. Petersburg State University. In this respect, we enjoyed valuable support of the secretary of the Dissertation Council, Alexander Gnotov, as well as Ilya Dementiev, the first vice-rector of St. Petersburg University. We were also cherished and cared of by Vladimir Demeyev, the HR person, and also other members of the St. Petersburg University Expertise Center, Tamara Aiba and Larisa Khrushcheva. Now in Russian. I would like to express my heartfelt and passionate gratitude to Professor Christine Baron, a famous and a renowned French scholar, for the fact that she agreed to participate, to take the time to thoroughly study the dissertation, and for such a meticulous and favorable report to Elmira's dissertation. That's a great honor for all of us and enormous pleasure, Professor Baron. I'm so much thankful to Professor Christine Baron and to everyone present here. Professor Burova, thank you so much. So now it is time for us to decide whether we are going to make a break for voting or not. Do we need a break? No, we don't need a break. In that case, we are not. We go on, and now we proceed on to open voting. I now put to vote the issue whether to award Elmira Viktorovna with the aspired academic degree of the Candidate of Sciences, PhD in Foreign Literature. May I remind you that the decision of the Dissertation Board is considered legitimate if all of the members of the Dissertation Board, but no less than 2/3 of the composition of the Dissertation Board have voted in favor. Distinguished Veronika Altashina, Professor Altashina, are you in favor or against? I'm in favor. My decision is pass. Thank you. Professor Alilova, I'm in favor. Elmira Vasileva deserves to be awarded the aspired academic degree of the Candidate of Sciences, PhD in Literature. Tatiana, your decision? I'm in favor, definitely in favor, to support Elmira Viktorovna and to award her the aspired academic degree. Natalia, your opinion? Of course I'm in favor. I'm in favor. I believe that Elmira Vasileva deserves to be awarded the aspired academic degree of Doctor of Philology, Candidate of Sciences. Professor Brontë, your decision?
I'm in favor. I was convinced by her arguments when she replied to my report, and I'm really in favor.
Thank you so much, Professor Brontë. My personal opinion, my decision, as of the chair of the jury, is of course in favor of awarding Elmira Vasileva with the aspired academic degree of Doctor of Philology, Candidate of Philology. Thus, may I declare the results of the voting procedure. Distinguished colleagues, dear guests, the results of the voting procedure are as follows. All the 6 members of the jury voted in favor of Elmira's dissertation to award Elmira Vasileva the expired academic degree. None of the members of the jury voted against. Therefore, may I consider that we have adopted the decision to award Elmira Vasileva with the aspired academic degree of the Candidate of Philology in the specialty 100103. May I now give the floor to Elmira Vasileva for her concluding statement. I'll be brief. I'm so much sorry for this technical interference. First and foremost, I would like to extend my gratitude to members of the jury for their time in this highly complicated situation, for the fact that they agreed to once again be members of the dissertation board and the jury, for their recommendations, for their reports and their time. I would like to extend my gratitude to the administration of St. Petersburg University for organizing my defense, to Alexander Gnotov, a representative of the Center of Expertise. And I would like to say a huge thank you to my colleagues of the Foreign Literature department at St. Petersburg University, who have supported me cordially over the last months, and their support was highly valuable to me. And my enormous gratitude, most passionate gratitude, to my research supervisor, Professor Burova. We've been working together for a long time already, so I think 10 years already, and those were the happiest 10 years of my life, thanks to Professor Burova. It is more than a privilege for me to be your student and your disciple. I'm proud to be your student, and I'm happy that for your help, for making my dream come true, for assisting me in delivering on my dreams. Thank you so much. Thank you, Elmira. The meeting of the dissertation board is declared adjourned. Please switch off the online broadcasting. Thank you very much for participation.